Welcome back to Movies Outpost. Today we'll be going over another banger movie franchise titled Taken. This will include Taken 1, Taken 2 as well as Taken 3. Without further ado, make sure to sit back, relax and enjoy the recap. The first movie kicks off with a recording of a young girl's birthday party. Opening up her toys and blowing out her 5-year-old birthday cake, Bryan Mills awakens before turning on his lamp and looking at a portrait. That morning, Bryan makes his way to a local store to buy a karaoke machine. Once he returns home, the gift is gift-wrapped and ready to go. Later in the day, Bryan makes his way to a gorgeous mansion for his daughter's birthday party. Immediately, he is approached by Lenore, his ex-wife. Not allowing him to go to the kids section, the two obviously have beef with one another when Bryan's daughter rushes and gives him a hug. Kim then proceeds to open up the gift to find the karaoke machine and thanks her dad as she aspires to be a singer one day. Simultaneously, Kim's stepfather walks in with a horse, which just shows how rich and successful of a man he is. Stuart immediately taunts Bryan, and it is obvious these two have more beef than Kendrick and Drake. Later that night, Bryan puts Kim's birthday picture in her picture book and reminisces over the good old days in the solitude of his house. Feeling quite lonely, his friends suddenly surprise him with some drinks and a simple barbecue. They speak on how Bryan is a retired soldier and laugh at how he has an attention-to-detail problem and must know everything about everyone. The four men then have a laugh with each other and their good times they had when they were stationed together. On their way out, Sam tells Bryan of a gig to take a singer to and from her concert for $2,500. Being quite the deal for only 4 hours of work, he obviously says yes, because I would not recap this trilogy if he turned down that deal. The following night, Bryan and his friends escort the pop star Shira to the festival. Taking the celebrity into her room to get prepped, Bryan introduces himself to her and mentions he has a daughter who wants to be a singer and if she has any tips. Shira says to pick another career and goes to perform. As the boys play some poker waiting for the festival to finish, Bryan gets a call from Kim, who is quite impressed that her dad got to meet Shira. She mentions wanting to have lunch tomorrow with him, and a father could not be more happy than this. Upon finishing, Shira is walking to her car when a gate is opened and fans start pouring in. As Shira walks with Bryan, a man with a knife attacks them but is easily subdued. The pop star is quickly taken into the car, to which Bryan gives her a drink to help her relax. Beginning to cry, she lies on Bryan's shoulder, and once the night is completed, all men receive their pay for the night. Bryan gets asked to see Shira in her room, and he goes there to a very grateful woman. She hands Bryan a card and makes him understand that his daughter could be a singer. Both her vocal coach and manager's number are on the card, and the payments is her shout. Bryan thanks her and she thanks him for saving her life. Following this, Bryan is ecstatic at meeting his daughter, who is problematically accompanied by his ex-wife. Kim explains to her dad that her friend Amanda is going to France with her cousins and invited her to tag along. Seeing that she is under 18, both parents need to sign for her to leave the country without them, and this hurts Bryan, who thought his daughter wanted to just go out with him. Nonetheless, he mentions he is not comfortable with her traveling and proposes he tags along. Lenore puts it on him, and Kim begins to cry and leaves before he gets to show her the card he got for her. Lenore then has a one-on-one with Bryan and makes sure her insults hit deep before leaving also.
You're pathetic.
Feeling quite bad, he quickly goes back to Kim and accepts under the condition she calls him every night. That gets quite a loud and happy reaction from his daughter. When the time comes, Bryan takes Kim to the airport and gives her places she should avoid in Paris. Kim mentions how her mother calls him a paranoid from his job, which she only knows was government-facilitated work. Having a D&M with each other, Kim kisses her father and soon arrives at the airport. Problematically, when unloading the baggage, Bryan sees a map detailed with quite a few locations, routes and dates on it. When Lenore arrives, he questions her and she admits to knowing Kim's true travel plans, that she wants to follow a rock band's tour around Europe. Bryan is pissed at hearing this, and Lenore pleads with him not to break their daughter's heart. He agrees and puts on a smile to keep her happy and takes a photo of her before letting her go. Soon enough, Kim and Amanda land in Paris and go to take a photo when a stranger offers his services. Introducing himself as Peter, he and the two girls have some banter with one another, only for Peter to offer them a lift to their place. Bryan, as you'd expect, calls his daughter, who is busy hanging out with Peter outside Amanda's place. Peter invites the girls to a party that night, and Amanda accepts against Kim's judgment, and he tells them to be ready at 9. Immediately after leaving the two girls, Peter calls someone and says there are two 18-year-old girls on the 5th floor. The two girls meanwhile are excited to be abroad with each other, but Kim isn't too happy Amanda lied about using hotels, even though they were at her cousin's place. Amanda doesn't give it a second thought and just turns up some music. Simultaneously though, Bryan tries calling his daughter, who does not hear her phone ring due to Amanda being a little crazy. Bryan then decides to call Lenore, who quickly tells him to stop being a paranoid and ends the phone. Finally though, Kim sees her dad calling and goes to a quiet part of the house to answer her phone. Bryan says he'd like to speak to one of Amanda's cousins there, and Kim confesses they are not there but promises she did not know. Out of nowhere, Kim's heart drops when she spots men approach Amanda from behind and grab her. Seems a kidnapping is taking place in live time, and Bryan quickly grabs as much information as he can from her, including Peter and how he looks. He records the call and learns there are 3 to 4 people and instructs her to hide under a bed. He then tells his daughter the men are going to find her, but he wants her to be brave and leave the phone on the floor and scream the captor's details as they drag her away. She remains quiet, her heart pounding as Bryan listens to the men talking. However, they just walk out of the room and Kim is relieved until she is suddenly yanked from underneath the bed and Bryan is forced to listen to the worst thing a father could ever hear. After realizing the kidnappers have now picked up his daughter's phone, he sends them the scariest threat I've ever heard.
If you let my daughter go now, that'll be the end of it. But if you don't, I will look for you, and I will kill you.
Immediately calling Sam to analyze the voice, Bryan rushes to Lenore's house and tells her off alongside Stuart. Taking control of the situation, he tells Stuart to use his connects to fly him to Paris immediately, when Sam calls him back and says the man was an Albanian named Marco and is a mobster boss. Known for trafficking, he recently decided that traveling women are an easier target and kidnaps them, gets them addicted to stuff and pretty much destroy their lives. With a 96-hour window to find Kim forever, Lenore cannot handle it and cries her eyes out. Bryan gets directly on a plane and listens to the call over and over where the captor taunts Bryan saying, "Good luck." Arriving in Paris, Bryan wastes no time in sneaking his way into Amanda's cousin's place by scaling the apartment from another level. Breaking his way in, he immediately looks for clues on the abduction and notices a trashed house. Visualizing what would have taken place, he imagines where his daughter was when she was snatched from underneath the bed while playing the phone audio. With perfect attention to detail, he looks at a broken mirror and grabs a glass shard with blood for evidence. Collecting the SD card from Kim's phone, he goes through its photos and stops when he notices Peter's reflection when he was taking a photo of the girls from earlier. Back at the airport, Peter sits there and gets a heads up from a man. Peter goes on to follow a girl and immediately asks her to share a cab as they are expensive. Just as she agrees, Bryan chucks Peter into the cab and immediately begins extracting information from the lowlife. As the man from earlier tries saving Peter, he is easily taken care of as police approach the scene, which causes Bryan to steal the cab and chase Peter down. With nowhere to go, Peter decides his only option is to jump, and he skillfully lands on a truck beneath him and on the street. Problematically though, he is clocked by a random truck and Bryan is forced to just walk away. Not giving up though, he links up with one of his old connects from the past, a man named Jean-Claude. Immediately providing the details of his daughter's abduction, Jean-Claude, now a prominent figure in the government, tells Bryan to make his way to a downtrodden area at night. As expected, Bryan heads down to the exact place, but not before picking up a translator by the name Gregor. Paying him for 10 hours ahead of time, Bryan goes to the street and starts speaking to a woman there. Realizing he's not really there for a good time, the woman tries to walk away, but Bryan intentionally provokes her until a man approaches and shoos the girls away. He then grabs Bryan, who places an audio bug on him and is then forced to hand over $50 for costing him business. Once he leaves, Bryan turns on the bug and gets his translator to tell him the exact words the men are saying. Seems they're interested in sports and also speak on a construction site until one man mentions the new merchandise being a problem for them. Bryan thanks the translator for his work and drives off, but seems to have a tail on him. Soon enough, at a construction site that night, there is a lineup to get inside a small building. Bryan hides his face and pays his dues before walking inside to discover covered-up makeshift rooms with numbers on them. Seeing the room number he was sent to, he sees a woman lying there with marks on her arms. Disgusted at the men holding these women as prisoners, he walks from room to room looking for his daughter or Amanda. Out of nowhere, his attention to detail works out when he notices his daughter's jacket. He asks the woman there how she got the item, but the woman is too out of it to understand. Simultaneously, a man walks in on them and cops a bashing. Pissed off, Bryan begins dismantling each thug in his wake and kills some of them. The rest of the pathetic lowlives attempt to catch him as he places the girl in the car and gets shot at. Bullets fly from all directions and Bryan decides fleeing is a better alternative, but not before causing an explosion to slow his enemies. Flying through the job site, his pursuers give chase and shoot at him. He manages to completely flip one of their cars though and continues as some more pull up close behind him. Taking out one more useless life, Bryan makes the decision to pull up next to the man from earlier. Smartly using the mud from under him, he covers the thug's windshield, which causes him to crash into an excavator. Bryan quickly makes his way onto the road, but the tail from earlier contacts Jean-Claude and says he's watching him. Bryan notices this though and takes a red light to get away from yet another nuisance. Hijacking and switching cars to avoid more irritants, Bryan makes his way to an old contact of his and gets a room for himself and the girl. Giving her some medicine to help alleviate the pain, he finally takes a moment of rest. Suddenly his phone rings and Jean-Claude is on the other line and wants to talk. The next day, while waiting for him, Bryan makes sure to keep his range and realizes an operation by the government is taking place to arrest him for his mess. However, Jean-Claude has managed to get him a first-class flight back home due to Bryan's past services rendered for them. But with 7 dead people and buildings destroyed, Bryan needs to leave. Bryan refuses though and makes a fool out of the French agents and walks away as if nothing ever happened. Later on, Bryan begins studying Albanian when the girl he rescued awakens and begins to panic. After relaxing her, he questions where she got the jacket from while holding a photo of Kim. The young girl explains she was abducted and forced into a red house where a young girl gave her the jacket. Crying, she further explains a sign she remembers seeing of her abduction spot. Bryan immediately heads there and just walks straight inside the complex and hands over his friend's card and threatens them with 30 agents unless he speaks to the boss. The boss agrees to meet with him, and Bryan links up with multiple men and says he wants to negotiate the rate. They say that they have already done that with Mr. McCon, who Bryan mentions has been moved. The men there, thinking he is Jean-Claude, listen as he asks which one is Marco and doesn't get an answer. Threatening them with an extra 10% for not answering his questions, he lectures them and demands 20% of profits for at least a year. With that, one of the men hands over some money only for Bryan to hand over a note in Albanian for the men to translate for him. They laugh, and one of them tells him good luck, which is the exact person who threatened him earlier on the phone. Bryan tells the man he found him, and he realizes who Bryan is just as a fight takes place. Bryan isn't messing around though, and completely obliterates all men that dare approach him. Killing one after the other without missing a single shot, he heads upstairs to find abducted girls in room after room. However, he discovers Amanda, who is unfortunately dead, taking the man that told him good luck earlier prisoner. Bryan uses his torture tactics from past experience to get information from the man. Doing whatever is necessary, the man refuses to talk and spits in Bryan's face, which earns him some excruciating pain. After finally conceding, he says Kim was sold to a man named St. Clair. Getting what he wants, Bryan makes sure to leave his prisoner electrocuted and walks away, knowing he will die from it. That night, Jean-Claude returns to his house and his family when he sees Bryan as well. Going to tuck his children in for the night, Jean-Claude picks up a pistol before getting back to the dinner table. Bryan mentions Mr. McCon's name and the wife says she knows him. Bryan asks his friend if he is involved in this mess, only for Jean-Claude to tell him he is taking bribes to look away. He then aims his gun at Bryan and says he's taking him to the airport, to which Bryan drops the pistol's bullets on the table and has already emptied out the gun. Taking out his own, he shoots the wife in the shoulder before threatening to end her life.
As the bullet I put between her eyes.
Jean-Claude finally agrees to look for St. Clair and provides the address and photo he's looking for. Bryan then knocks out his friend and finally knows where his daughter is. As you'd expect, Bryan heads straight there with an undercover cop badge and gets his way into a party there. Looking around, he spots his low-life target go to an elevator, and he quickly approaches and holds a guard at gunpoint. After knocking him out, Bryan goes through the place until a waiter spots him. Taking him out and posing as a waiter himself, Bryan kills one of the pathetic low-lives participating in this hideous activity. Bryan then quickly discovers a room full of rich scumbags that are buying their own personal play toys, which sells for hundreds of thousands. Bryan then spots his daughter, who begins at $100,000. He forces the man in the room with him to bid and win the auction at $500,000. Problematically though, as Bryan goes to collect Kim, he is dropped. Once he regains consciousness, St. Clair discovers that Kim is his daughter and tells him that he is also a father. However, business is business, and he must die. As he leaves, the goons go to kill him but greatly underestimate his skills when he breaks himself free and single-handedly kills one attacker at a time and uses one of their own guns against them. St. Clair's man then goes to check the gunshot and he too is killed. St. Clair immediately begins pleading for his life, and bullets are put into him to reveal Kim's location before Bryan ends him.
It wasn't personal.
It was all personal to me.
Running straight out, he sees the car his daughter is in and sprints through the streets to keep up with it. Spotting the boat all the girls are on, he needs a new plan and decides to hijack a car. Flying through the streets, he even uses the footpath to quickly make his way towards a bridge. Almost hitting cars coming his way, he skillfully evades traffic, and the buyer from earlier talks to his boss on the boat. Bryan then gets to the bridge as the boat passes through, and he silently takes out a man on board. Finding a second target, he is thrown overboard while the girls are being taken to their rooms. The men on board eventually spot Bryan and go on the hunt for him, only to be hunted themselves. Silently killing one pathetic human soul after the other, gunshots are fired and the other men are on the ready. They spread out and look for their target, who even whilst being shot at by an automatic, kills his targets. Once out of ammo, he gets into close-quarter combat with the boss's right-hand man, and he sure as hell puts up a good fight. Eventually though, Bryan gets the better of him and ends his pathetic, useless life. Going into the main room to see his daughter, the man asks to negotiate, but Kim cannot believe that her father went around the globe, killed so many people, and found her when not even governments could. A long hug is well deserved and they finally go back home. Kim is reunited with her mother and Stuart, who tells Bryan whatever he needs is his. Lenore then approaches her ex and with tears in her eyes thanks him. He gets a hug and the family finally leave, but not before Kim once again thanks her dad for everything he has done for her. Some while later, Bryan takes his daughter to meet up with Shira. Kim is literally speechless but is invited inside to kick off her new musical career. Taken 2 kicks off in Albania with a truck driving through the mountains to a village named Tropoje. A man named Murad Krasniki tells the village and family that a man killed their loved ones, their sons, their brothers, and will be brought to the village for justice. At Los Angeles, meanwhile, Bryan works at a car wash and goes about his usual life. At exactly 2 p.m. he goes to Lenore and says he's here for Kim's driving lesson. Lenore begins laughing and it seems these two are getting along quite well after the whole abduction fiasco. However, Lenore tells Bryan Kim isn't home and is seeing someone. Having a drink with one another, we discover that Stuart and Lenore have split and Bryan comforts his ex before leaving. Going straight to where Kim is at, Jamie opens the door and invites him in. Kim is not happy about her dad invading her privacy and leaves. Driving with her dad, Kim tells him that no one knows where Jamie lives and it seems that Bryan had placed a GPS tracker in his daughter's phone, telling him that she is traumatized and already doesn't feel normal. These shenanigans just make it worse. However, Kim does calm down and tells her dad she understands where he's coming from, and tells him she loves him and not to do it again. Once Kim is out of sight, Bryan immediately gets Sam to run a background check on Jamie. In Paris that night, Jean-Claude gets to his office and sends his guard upstairs as he picks up a letter. Following him up though, he discovers his man dead and pulls out a gun to be on the ready, but is useless when a gunman approaches from behind and knocks him out. He soon awakens to multiple people around him, interrogating him on the location of Bryan. Repeatedly saying he does not know is not helping him and causes quite some discomfort and pain. The man there shows Jean-Claude his own card, the one Bryan used to make his way inside the trafficking house to kill his brother. Back at Los Angeles, once 2 p.m. hits, Bryan awaits his daughter, then goes to the door to find Lenore crying her eyes out, telling Bryan that she had a trip planned with Stuart and Kim and that Stuart canceled everything for no reason. She calls Stuart a vicious coward and Bryan offers her whatever she needs, including a place to stay if she wants. After telling his friends this later that night, they all have a laugh at him and say there is no longer any tension between him and Lenore. At Tirana, Albania, meanwhile, Suko, the man that was torturing Jean-Claude earlier, hands over some money to a government employee to discover that Bryan is headed to Istanbul. With pinpoint accuracy, Bryan is there working as a security guard. Calling Lenore to speak with her and Kim, he is over the moon when he discovers they've followed him to Istanbul as a surprise visit. He is confused on how they found him, only to reveal Sam gave them some inside information. Escorting them to their new residence with a gorgeous view, he lets the 2 girls settle as he goes to finish work. Murad and his crew in the meantime drive from Albania and arrive in Istanbul. While Bryan finishes work for the day and packs up his weapons and gear, he heads back to Lenore and Kim. Lenore tells him she wants to just hang out and have a bath. Seems Kim and Bryan are going out on their own and weirdly enough Bryan takes her to a club. Soon after, they go on a boat cruise where he explains history to his daughter. Bryan then questions his daughter on Jamie and wants to know how serious they are. However, Kim says it was nothing compared to him and her mother, who describes meeting him as magical. The following day, the Albanians drive and link up with Suko, where Murad asks,
"Is everything prepared?"
As you requested.
He then walks inside an abandoned place where his men get up. At the hotel Bryan is at though, an Albanian lookout calls Murad and tells him Bryan is leaving when he stops and says he's onto him and goes to leave. Lenore and Kim then meet up with Bryan, where Kim this time says she wants to kick back by the pool, trying to get both her parents to have some alone time. However, as they walk off, another lookout calls Murad and informs him Kim is staying all alone. Lenore and Bryan finally have a very deep and meaningful conversation about their relationship and how Bryan has changed and become a family man, unaware of the thugs following their vehicle. Soon enough though, Bryan notices the tail and confirms it by making the driver go a different route, telling Lenore to stay calm and relax. They lose the tail and Bryan begins explaining to her that once they stop, she needs to head through a specific direction to get back into the hotel and immediately alert security and hide in the room until he returns. Panicking, he has to tell her to focus, and as the car stops, she leaves and Bryan takes over the driver's seat. Murad is alerted to Bryan spotting them and a car pursuit immediately takes place. Attempting to call Kim, she doesn't pick up and he simultaneously stops the car in an alley but is nonetheless spotted and shot at. Getting sandwiched between 2 cars, the Albanian thugs all get out with their guns on the ready, only to see the car empty. Lenore problematically runs into a locked gate and Bryan is seen sprinting. The thugs chase him on foot, who realize he knows these roads much better than them. Deciding to lure one of the main thugs into an alley, Bryan takes him out only for another to try and fail. Using his skills, Bryan quite easily deals with 2 enemies at the same time when 2 more join the fight. They stand no chance though, and the fighting stops when both Bryan and an Albanian hold guns on each other. Lenore is problematically dragged into the equation though, and Bryan calls Kim one more time, who finally answers the phone. Saying he is going to be taken just as she was, he directs her to head to a specific room and hide in a specific closet immediately. He then hangs up and breaks his phone while surrendering to the Albanians. They smash him to the ground and bag both of their new prisoners while Kim gets on the move. The duo are then dragged into a van and taken away, but Bryan listens and pays attention to every turn and sound around them. Counting the seconds on the stopwatch, the Albanians make their way into Kim's room to find it empty. Security is then alerted to immediately head to the 4th floor, and Kim in the meantime rushes into her dad's room and climbs out of the window while her dad still analyzes all details around him to perfection. The van finally stops at Murad's temporary base of command while the Albanians get into Bryan's room and find Kim's slippers just as Kim gets into the next room and hides in a closet. The Albanians also begin climbing to the next 2 rooms and Kim hears one of them inside. Remaining quiet in the closet, the man opens it and finds nothing. Going to open the 3rd one though, his teammate gets into a room and kills a witness there, causing Kim's man to rush out. Simultaneously, security arrives on the 4th floor only to get gunned down by the Albanians. The hotel is immediately placed on alert, and Kim is safe for the time being. But Bryan on the other hand is not safe at all, being tied up and alone in a room. He begins using his feet to push a device out of his pants. He then raises it up and attempts grabbing it with his hands, but it drops. He does it again though, and this time grabs it to reveal it is a phone. Immediately calling Sam, he problematically does not pick up the phone. A bad habit people in this series all have. Kim, however, answers and Bryan lets her know of the situation before telling her to get to the US Embassy. Saying that she wants to find and save both her parents, Bryan refuses, but changes his mind when she too refuses to listen. Leaving the closet, she grabs her dad's suitcase and inputs the combination to reveal a lot of stuff. But using a map, Bryan instructs her to grab one of his shoelaces from his closet. Also using a pen, she draws a 3-kilometer radius from the hotel, followed by a 3-kilometer radius of the markets. But with no overlapping areas, he instructs her to grab a grenade from his suitcase and find an empty place to throw it where he can hear it. Taking out the pin, she throws the grenade underneath a car and blows it up. Bryan counts the seconds it takes to hear it and tells his daughter to draw another circle of 4.5 kilometers around the hotel. This time there are 2 intersected points, and Kim goes to the rooftops to tell him which way the flags are blowing. He then tells her to go to the east point of where the circles overlap and to take his pistol and 2 grenades and head to a rooftop and wait for his signal. He is then forced to end the call and hide the phone behind his foot. Leaving the room, Kim makes her way to the street and into a cab. Back with Bryan, he is repeatedly punched as Murad walks into the room. Murad begins showing him photos of the men Bryan killed in his attempt to save Kim from her abductors. He explains they are fathers, husbands, brothers, and that he killed them all. Showing him a photo of the man he electrocuted to death, Murad reveals that man was his son Marco. Telling Bryan he will be taken to their village, Bryan says Marco was a human filth and gets a slap for speaking like that. Murad then threatens him by saying,
"Your death will not be quick. It will not be pleasant."
Lenore is then dragged into the room and cut before being hung upside down. With about 30 minutes until she loses enough blood to kill her, Murad then tells Bryan Kim will be found and sent to the lowest low lives in the world. He then leaves and locks the room before being informed they lost Kim, and he goes to personally fetch her himself. Bryan in the meantime though begins using his expertise to start and get himself free while telling Lenore she needs to relax. Kim meanwhile leaves the cab and heads to where her dad told her. Bryan then cuts himself free and lowers Lenore before untying her. Kim gets to the rooftop her dad told her to get to and he immediately calls her to set off another grenade. She does so and the explosion is very close this time. Bryan gets his daughter to run 30 seconds east and throw another grenade while he plays around with some pipes. The Albanians hear the second grenade and go to check what is going on while the pipes emit enough vapor for Kim to see her parents' exact location. But Kim is brave enough to see that the Albanians have found her and still drops the pistol to her dad. As the Albanians go to check on Bryan, he grabs the gun and kills both intruders that make their way in. Leaving an injured Lenore behind, Bryan single-handedly takes out multiple Albanians and makes sure to put bullets in each one of them. Continuing through, he makes his way to the rooftop where Kim desperately jumps for her life. Putting up a good chase, one filthy scumbag still chases her and corners her. But Bryan comes to his daughter's rescue once again and Kim is in shock. After hijacking a taxi, Bryan explains the men are after him and parks in front of where Lenore is. After putting a 5-minute timer on his daughter's phone, she is to go straight to the US Embassy if he takes longer than 5 minutes. Once he leaves, Kim anxiously sits in the car while Bryan goes back to the jail to find Lenore missing. Seems the Albanians are trying to move her and cops simultaneously arrive on the scene. Putting Lenore in a van, Bryan cannot save Lenore in time, and the inspector on the scene calls Murad and informs him of the situation as the timer drops to 0 and Bryan puts a bullet into the copper before jumping into the cab and taking off. Directing her to the embassy, the cops in the area try to pull Kim over, who does not even have a license. Listening to her dad's commands, she pulls quite a decent cop chase and smacks into a few of them. This should honestly be enough to pass her driving test in America, because wow is she doing a good job. Albanians even attempt to get the car off the road, but with her dad's help they are the ones who cannot have children anymore. Still gunning it, they smash through a gate and are shot at once again. Bryan returns fire and as a train approaches, he makes his daughter floor it and just make it past, but the Albanians aren't as fortunate. Finally, arriving at the US Embassy, they speed through and get down as they are shot at, but smash through the gate and stop in the middle of the embassy. Immediately calling Sam to give one of his friends a call to not get shot, he confesses that his plan to leave his daughter here and make sure these scumbags never bother them ever again. Back with Lenore, Murad walks into the room she's tied up in and asks her what should he do with her. On the streets the next day, Bryan traces his steps back to find out where Lenore is. Lenore, funnily enough, still finds the energy to taunt and annoy Murad. Honestly though, I would have crapped my pants about 20 times by now, so hats off to her. Bryan, however, is running out of time and still traces his steps while the instruments are getting prepped for Lenore. Bryan, with his perfect attention to detail from earlier, remembers and finds the exact spot Lenore is being held. Simply making his way in, he kills the guard standing outside. With his gun now on the ready, the final battle is soon to commence. Stealthily knocking out another thug, he steals a gun he can do real damage with. With perfect accuracy, he does exactly that and takes out 3 goons. Murad and his other men quickly rush to move Lenore as Bryan makes another thug go flying 10 stories down. Feeling bad, he sends a friend down there to accompany him before continuing his mission. The Albanians try to get lucky and shoot through a wall to hit their target, but are unsuccessful and lose their lives one after the other. Knowing that Lenore is close, he dismantles his opponents and makes them regret their decision of coming near his family. Lenore is still dragged away though, and onto the street where Bryan gives chase. After a couple minutes of wandering around, he sees Lenore unconscious on the ground. Both he and Suko then aim their guns at each other and both fire and miss. A hand-to-hand combat takes place instead though, and this is a battle of the masters. With both throwing amazing combos and defense at the same time, Suko brandishes a knife and uses it. Not following the fair code of no weapons, Bryan is problematically hit hard, and he nonetheless slams his opponent and ends his life. Picking up a pistol, he goes to Lenore and grabs one of the Albanians' phone to call Murad. Coming face to face with Murad, who has given up, Bryan instead discovers Murad has 2 more sons who will also come after him. Bryan gives Murad an ultimatum, telling him to go home and live a life with his family. But Murad cannot forget the son that has already died, and Bryan makes it known he must live with it just like the parents of all those kidnapped girls. He continues by saying if Murad gives his word, then he'll drop the gun and walk away, as he is tired of it all and just wants his family. Murad agrees and Bryan drops the gun next to him and walks away, but Murad picks it up and pulls the trigger, only to discover Bryan took out the bullet. Failing this test, Bryan kills Murad and walks to Lenore. Getting her up, he tells her everything is okay now and they are all safe. 3 weeks later, Bryan awaits his daughter to complete her driving test. The instructor gives her a perfect score and congratulates her before Bryan gives her a hug. Going to celebrate, they head to a wharf and link up with Lenore. Surprisingly though, him invites Jamie, who shakes Bryan's hand, and they all sit down for a good time. The Taken finale opens up with a man named Clarence looking for his checkbook. His wife Claire, who is in the bathroom putting on some makeup, says it's downstairs. As Clarence finds his book, he is simultaneously met by some men who force him to tell his wife he is walking the dog. Once outside, the leader of the men named Maxim throws Clarence into the boot of his car. Holding him like a dog, the men escort him to his own office where a man named Oleg Malenkov sits on his chair. He then begins speaking and tells Clarence his boss owes him a lot of money, and seeing as he is the accountant, he wants his money now. Forcing him to open the safe, it seems to be empty, and Oleg pushes the accountant into the safe and makes a voicemail recording for the boss telling him he has left him a gift before gunning down Clarence. The next day, we see Bryan buying a massive teddy bear for Kim, who discovers she is pregnant. Wishing her an early happy birthday, Bryan gives her the gift just as Kim's partner Jimmy walks in and greets them. Talking about how predictable both Kim and her father are, Kim is in all sorts right now, discovering that she is pregnant, and gives off a funny vibe, causing Bryan to go exchange the bear for something else. Once he leaves, Lenore gives him a call and laughs at his failure of a gift. They both speak on how grown up their little baby girl has become, and that night Bryan prepares dinner when Lenore walks in. Being quite stressed, she mentions that she and Stuart have tried everything to rekindle their relationship, but it is not working. Hinting that she is more interested in someone else, Bryan does not want to cause any problems between her and Stuart, and instead hands her a key to his house in case she wants somewhere to be alone, as he is leaving town for a few days. On her way out though, she drops her jacket and leaves in style. With a sunny morning the next day, Bryan and his friends are golfing when they invite him to a 4-man job that will take a month. He isn't too interested though, and Kim calls him saying she wants to meet up. Immediately linking up with her, she wants some advice on the baby but does not have the courage to say it just yet, and changes the topic to adopting a puppy. Bryan, however, thinks that isn't the best idea, pretty much calling Kim a bit irresponsible. That night, interestingly enough, Stuart visits Bryan and wants to have a chat with him when he discovers Lenore's drop jacket on the couch. He then mentions that for Lenore and his relationship to work, Bryan needs to completely be out of the equation. Telling Stuart that nothing is going on between him and Lenore, Stuart does not believe him, and says he wants zero contact between the two of them, to which Bryan agrees. The next morning, while out for a jog, Bryan returns home to get a message that Lenore wants to urgently see him and wants some bagels. Walking out to grab some, Maxim is watching him from the other side of the road. Quickly getting the bagels and returning home, he finds Lenore's car outside, and when he comes in he finds a knife on the ground. With a broken heart, he then discovers Lenore on his bed dead. With no pulse, cops rush into the house and go to arrest him, thinking he is the perpetrator. Putting his hands up, he instead decides to knock out both cops and steal one of their guns before making a run for it. Being pursued by more officers, he scales buildings, fences, and whatever comes into his path. Even getting shot at doesn't hinder him, and he decides to run into a random house and hide in the garage. While the cops try making their way in, he reveals a secret compartment he has somehow installed into the house and drops into the sewer drain. The cops radio in and have lost their target, who now sits all alone. Covered in the most vile of things, it does not faze him in the slightest way, as his heart is shattered by the death of his first love, his true love, who had gone through everything with him. Some while later, Kim gets a call from Bryan, who wants her to listen to him. He tells her that someone murdered Lenore in his apartment and is framing him. She is to trust no one, and he hangs up the call before she could tell him the news of her being pregnant. At the crime scene, Detective Frank Dotzler looks at the weapon, the blood in the house, and is told that an anonymous reporter called in and said a woman was screaming for her life. Eating one of the bagels, he realizes it is still hot. Bryan immediately calls Sam and asks if the code is still the same and gets a confirmation. Canvassing the area, Frank is puzzled how Bryan just disappeared and looks around. Moving the truck, he discovers the hole where Bryan vanished in. Bryan in the meantime heads to a warehouse and goes to the back to open up a secret door. Heading to a place he and the boys had ready, he picks up a strap and wants to kill the people responsible for this. Frank meanwhile speaks to Stuart, and Kim comes from Lenore's bedroom crying and asks Frank if they could leave it for another time. He respects her wishes and tells Garcia to vacate the bedroom. Kim then has a breakdown and swears that Bryan did not do it and tells Stuart to back off. Telling Frank that her dad loved Lenore, she walks away. Being through hell and back with her mother and father, this time she is all alone and when she needs it the most. At the morgue, Stuart tells Frank about both incidents in Paris and Istanbul, and while he doesn't have all the details, Bryan's life is surrounded by dangerous people. With guts of steel though, Bryan sneaks his way into the morgue with the cops being outside. Pulling Lenore's body out, he stares at her in disbelief and grabs a strand of hair before putting her body back. Frank then tells his team that Bryan is a ghost, a man that joined the army at 21 and special forces at 23 before completely disappearing. For the time being, the best way to find him is by watching his daughter. He also wants both Bryan and Lenore's GPS coordinates downloaded and corresponded, but Bryan beats them to it. Getting into Lenore's car to grab the data, Garcia and another man walk towards the car. However, the GPS coordinates are downloaded and Bryan escapes just before the men see him. Back at his makeshift headquarters, Bryan goes through Lenore's previous coordinates, and one place is quite strange. Heading to a gas station some distance away, Bryan acts as an officer and asks the receptionist for information, but she doesn't have any. Going to another worker, Bryan asks to look at the surveillance tapes. Looking through the tapes, he hears officers arriving at the station, but also sees Lenore on camera. The officers ask the receptionist for information on Lenore, only for her to say she already told them. Discovering that Bryan is acting as an officer, they rush to arrest him just as he realizes Lenore was kidnapped, and he simultaneously gets caught red-handed while spotting a tattoo on the hand of one of the kidnappers. Giving himself up, the two officers escort Bryan out in handcuffs, where he is immediately arrested for the murder of Lenore. Frank is alerted to the new development and calls Garcia in a panic. Saying Bryan intentionally got himself arrested, he tells all the cops to stop their cars immediately. They don't listen to him though and mock Frank, while Bryan quietly unlocks his handcuffs and disarms both officers, only to chuck out the passenger and hold the other hostage. Forcing him at gunpoint to speed, he intentionally goes on the wrong side of the road and, let's just say, causes a few accidents to happen. Garcia and his man get out and aim their guns at Bryan, who is hit from other cars around him. Forcing the officer to drive off, he eventually stops the car and kicks him out. Downloading the data from the police computer, Frank is in a chopper when the call is announced, and Bryan is pursued. Multiple police cars attempt to stop him, but his driving skills are second to none. Making a barricade, multiple officers shoot at him, but this isn't enough to stop him. In a car park, he intentionally stops the car, then puts it in reverse to fall and get stuck in an elevator. The car then ignites and takes out a massive part of the building, when Frank is suddenly called by none other than Bryan, who tells him he now knows what he's capable of. He tells Frank that he is innocent and needs 2 days to prove it before dumping the phone and walking off. Frank goes through the surveillance video with Garcia and is in shock when he discovers that a group of men abducted Lenore. Bryan already knows this though and has a visitor in his base of operations. Sam is told the details of everything that has happened so far and is handed all police intel of Lenore as well as a strand of her hair for analysis. At Lenore's funeral meanwhile, Frank sits outside with his surveillance van and listens on people hugging Kim and telling her it's going to be alright. Sam then runs some interference and jams the audio before telling Kim her dad will be in touch and to stick to her usual schedule. Realizing her dad is watching her from a hidden camera, she blows him a kiss and Frank exits the van to have a look at Kim in person. Once at home, Kim is annoyed at the constant presence of police at the house and tells off Stuart. She also mentions the fact that for 2 years the only thing he gave Lenore was sadness and regret and doesn't want to look at him. Heading off to school in her usual routine like her dad said, she parks her car and tells Garcia to stop following her. Heading inside the gas station as she usually does, she finds a message from her dad on a drink, and once she drinks the drink, she leaves as per usual. At campus that afternoon, Garcia listens in on a bug he placed on Kim, who suddenly tells her friend she feels nauseous and goes to leave. Garcia immediately gets out of the car to go check while Frank asks the owner of the gas station about Kim and her usual appearances every morning. Going to the rubbish outside, he discovers the cup and immediately alerts Garcia that backup is on the way. Once Kim goes to the bathroom, she discovers her dad there, who finds and hides the bug. Hugging her daughter, who is in emotional distress, she tells her dad she is pregnant, and 1,000 soldiers trying to kill him does not faze him as much as this news. Frank finally pulls up with multiple soldiers and rushes to the bathroom, where Kim informs her dad that Stuart is acting very weird recently. Placing the bug back on his daughter, Garcia rushes into the women's bathroom and looks through all the stalls only to find Kim by herself. Realizing their target is still somewhere around, Bryan knocks out a security guard and is then spotted by Frank and his team. Bryan makes a small fire and causes the water alarms to activate, providing himself an easy way to escape. Putting Kim into a room, Frank interrogates Kim, who tells him that her father is innocent and hands him back his bug before asking to go home. At Stuart's headquarters, meanwhile, he tells his security it's time to leave to Malibu and is the person that Oleg wants to try and find. Leaving with his security detail, Bryan decides to tail him when he suddenly is rammed into from behind. Not knowing who is following him, he is stopped and pushed off the edge, causing the car to flip over quite a few times. Maxim then comes out and throws a grenade to finally end Bryan once and for all. However, they underestimate him as he hijacks a random vehicle on the road and begins conversing with the driver until he sees the car that tried ramming him earlier and wants to find out who they are. Walking into the bottle shop, he begins taking out his attackers. Even when they pull out their guns, it isn't enough to stop him. Using his head, legs, and whatever he needs, he disarms and subdues his attackers before grabbing a pistol. Maxim then uses the reflection of a mirror to preemptively shoot at Bryan, who returns fire. Both men drop low and Bryan gets into close combat with Maxim, who is not a pushover. However, he ends up getting the best of his attacker and wants to know who hired him. But Maxim refuses to talk and decides death is an easier alternative. Stuart, in the meantime, is told his friends have arrived. Believing it to be Maxim and his thugs, he allows them in when he instead gets knocked out. Awakening with Bryan standing over him, he is pushed over, planning to get the information he wants out of him. He confesses he is confused and wants to know if the Russians were following him because they work for him. Stuart denies it and blames Lenore's death on Bryan, who wants to know what Stuart is hiding. After confessing that he owes Oleg Malenkov some money, he targeted Lenore, and as she was seeing Bryan behind his back, he didn't mention anything to the authorities. Bryan wants to know why Oleg is chasing him though, and it seems Stuart threatened them by using Bryan's name. Apologizing, Bryan shuts him up because they're coming after Kim next. Sitting all alone in her room, Sam aims his gun at a copper when Bryan's old crew all get to work. Bryan then makes his way into the house to knock out 2 guards. The final one is easily taken care of as well, and Kim sees her dad, who wants her to leave. The entire crew leave and Frank debriefs his team about Bryan's friends, who all have disappeared in their early 20s after serving the Navy SEALs or Special Forces. Being explosive demolitions or communicational experts, the only thing linking them together is their company named Private Security International. Putting up the feed of Maxim dying, Frank informs his team that he did not want to divulge any information and that something very strange is going on. He wants to bring in any of these 4 men who all know something they don't. Back at the base of operations, the main crew alongside Stuart and Kim have come to the conclusion that Oleg needs to be eliminated in order to keep Kim safe. Stuart then gives them all information on Oleg and says he served in the Russian army, was part of the Russian Special Forces, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, a man with his expertise was hired and in very high demand. Getting into business with him for heavy machinery, they made quite a profitable business when one of their deals went south. Kim loses the plot and wants to kill Stuart and blames him for her mother's death. Bryan then tells Stuart to call Oleg and put it on speaker. Answering his call, Oleg is told the money is ready and he tells Stuart to meet him at his penthouse in an hour. Having both his own private elevator as well as 2 guards, security upstairs can only move the escalator and are then also met by 3 more guards. There are 2 sets of doors followed by Oleg's private apartment. Making his way into the apartment, Sam gets into the car park while Stuart follows him soon after. Stuart gets out of his car alongside Bryan, who all enter the van when Frank coincidentally calls Stuart. Telling him that Bryan took Kim, he tries acting like he didn't know and says he is in Malibu and needs an hour to get back. Frank ends the call and tells Garcia to track Stuart's location, which gives the team around half an hour before they are swarmed by officers. Frank immediately gets the heads up on Stuart's location and the entire cavalry is on their way. Sam is alerted to this, and the operation begins. Bryan once again apologizes to his daughter for yet another problem in her life, and Frank gets an interesting call from one of his agents telling him that both Stuart and Lenore had life insurance at $12 million apiece. Hacking into the surveillance system to cut the live feed, Bryan takes out both guards out front. Stuart returns back to safety, and the boys completely disable all security cameras, allowing Bryan to cook and take out the 3 guards upstairs. All men rush to the location and try to fight back, but Bryan is a ghost and not to be trifled with. Getting shot at, he makes sure that even with their heavy artillery, it doesn't matter in the slightest of ways. Creeping his way into Oleg's room, he is shot at from above. Shooting hundreds of bullets, Bryan waits patiently for a shot and puts Oleg in an ugly position. But Oleg still fires so many rounds that this causes Bryan to get on the floor and be stood over. Oleg then puts Bryan into a chokehold and drops him to beat him up with his gun, aiming a pistol at him. Bryan gets up and manages to steal Oleg's gun and shoot him with it. Breathing his last few breaths, Oleg laughs and tells him that Stuart tricked them all. He explains that Stuart hired him to kill Lenore then Bryan, and if that doesn't work he sends Bryan to kill him. Laughing at the situation, Oleg says Lenore was just business and wants Bryan to kill him to get his revenge. However, Bryan does not do it and leaves him be when Kim simultaneously realizes from the police data that someone used Bryan's phone to set up Lenore. Stuart sees what's happening and shoots Sam while taking Kim hostage. The police also flood the entire building and spot Sam injured but still alive. The elevator starts coming down just then and the cops have their weapons on the ready to see it's empty and make their way up while Bryan hides in the shaft. Spotting all the dead bodies, the cops lock down the building and Bryan sees Sam injured. Stealing one of Oleg's cars, he realizes that Stuart used his phone the night he came to see him. Tracking Kim's phone, Bryan exits the car park and Stuart gets a private jet ready. Frank smartly enough gets the live location on the Porsche Bryan stole and calls him as well. Bryan answers Frank, who says he's worked it out that it was because of the life insurance policies. Bryan also reveals Stuart hired the Russians to kill Lenore and him and will not stop until Kim is safe. Arriving at the airport, Kim is taken to a plane as Bryan guns it in the Porsche to save his baby. Not caring about his own life, Stuart sees him make his way towards him and cannot believe it. Pumping the car towards the jet, he collides with the wheel and stops the jet from taking off. Holding Kim at gunpoint, he uses her as leverage and Bryan gets a good shot. Explaining the whole turn of events back to Stuart, he kicks him and with disgust and anger aims his pistol at the scumbag. With the cops arriving on the scene, Bryan goes to kill him but instead stops and tells him,
"With a good lawyer, you'll get out of jail in a few years. And we both know what's gonna happen."
He instead knocks him out and hugs his beautiful baby girl once again. Reliving the same fate over and over, he is tired and taken to headquarters where Frank explains he knew from the beginning that Bryan was innocent. He mentions how the bagels were hot, the phone messages and timestamps didn't align, and he figured it all out. Bryan then thanks the inspector and shakes his hand before leaving. Frank wraps up Bryan's file and Bryan in the meantime goes back to the same spot he goes to celebrate, telling both Kim and Jimmy he is so happy for them and will support them. Kim then breaks everyone's heart by saying,
"We've been talking. If it's a girl, we'd like to name her after Mom."
That's the end. If you stayed until this point, I thank you and would love it if you hit the like and subscribe button to help out the channel. And as always, have a good one and I'll catch you later. Stay awesome.